Hey guys, first and foremost, so sorry for the delays in the tutorials. Life gets in the way sometimes, but we're back. We're better than ever. Today we're going to look at some of the leaderboards that I frequent on Baseball Savant, the Arsenal's movement and active spin leaderboards. We're going to briefly get away from the batter player pages. We are going to return to those in a little bit. We're going to get even more in depth with the fielding, but we're getting away from the batter player pages for a good reason because we've got a very special guest. So to help us break down what's going on with the Arsenal's movement and active spin leaderboards, we are joined by unarguably one of the biggest names in the Statcast field today, a former Fangraphs and ESPN contributor, now part of the amazing crew bringing you the Statcast broadcasts along with Jason Benetti and Eduardo Perez, and really just so much else. You can find him on Twitter at Mike_Petriello, personal hero of mine, Mike Petriello. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Alex.
Yeah, of course. So why don't we go ahead and jump right in. So the first leaderboard that we are going to take a look at today on the Savant website is the Pitch Arsenal's leaderboard. So once we go ahead and click on Pitch Arsenal's leaderboard, we're going to see a bunch of different pitchers. Four-seamer is highlighted here. What else are we looking at here?
Yeah, right now when you first go to this page, the first thing you will see are these pitches rated by velocity. And this is really a pretty basic leaderboard. The idea behind it was previously, if you wanted to just do a simple list of velocity or who threw their slider the most, you'd have to go and do a specific search, a custom search through the search page. And that seemed like too much work for something this simple. So what this allows you to do is just have a quick list of who throws whatever pitch type you're interested in the hardest. So the way this is sorted right now is by four-seamer. Last year in 2019, 250 minimum pitches. Unsurprisingly, Jordan Hicks is at the top of this list, right? 100.9 miles an hour. You can sort this by whatever you want. If you want to know who throws their curveball the hardest, you can click on that. Joe Kelly, 87.2 miles an hour. A quick and easy way to get to velocity. And you can also, look at the bottom and see who throws it the softest as well. You can also sort this by lefties and righties or change the pitch minimums or whatever you want. But the most interesting other feature on this page is if you go to where it says average speed and you change that to percentage and you click update, it's the same idea. It just shows you who throws a particular pitch the most. So this will always sort by four-seamer to start with, and you can see that these guys at the top, Colin Poche and Doolittle and Hader throw their four-seamer, over 80% of the time. Again, a quick and easy way, like who throws their four-seamer the most? Who throws their changeup the most? If you click that, Luis Avilan, 58.3%. And this all comes from the pitch classification, like you'll see on game day and you'll see in the ribbon boards in the stadium that gets cleaned up after the game and everything. These numbers should mirror what you see on the Statcast player pages and everything. And then the final thing you can do here is average spin. Now, the numbers here are somewhat less interesting, like 100 miles an hour makes sense. Throwing your fastball 80% of the time makes sense. Some of these numbers where you'll see, 2642 and 1823 and all this kind of stuff, it's not necessarily useful on their own so much as it is the rank if you want to know if a guy is very good or very poor at spin. Again, it'll sort by four-seamer. Kind of a grab bag of names at the top. I think it doesn't surprise anybody. You'll see like Mike Minor is very high spin. Luke Bard is always very high spin. These guys aren't necessarily successful or not successful because they have spin. But if you do want to know who's got great spin, total spin, this is an easy way to do it without having to go and make a custom search on the search page.
Yeah, so we're gonna go and talk about average spin and how it compares to our next leaderboard, active spin, in a second. But for those who are watching this, you might notice that two-seamer is not here, neither is knuckle curve. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe two-seamer is brought into sinker, and knuckle curve is just under the curve category. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. Just to simplify, two-seamer and sinker are somewhat of the same pitch, and knuckle curve and curveball, for most people's purposes, are the same pitch. If you went to the search page and you made a custom search, you could split those out. But for most of the audience, it's not really necessary to get that granular.
So let's stick with Luke Bard here for a second, because one of the questions that I hear a lot is, average spin is very popular right now, right? Spin rate is a very, very popular metric, but there's one that was introduced a long time ago that we're going to look at next, which is the active spin leaderboard, and that's arguably just as important. Now, we saw Luke Bard with the 2746 average spin on his four-seamer. However, if we look at the active spin, I believe he's out of the top 300. His active spin is 82.8, and that's 389th on the leaderboard. Can you talk a little bit about, to lead into active spin, what the difference is between the two and maybe why this matters for, let's say, Luke Bard in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, spin is a tool in a pitcher's toolbox, right? Just because you throw the ball hard, it doesn't mean you're successful. Just because you have high spin, it doesn't mean you're successful, but it's a tool you can utilize. And really the entire point of spin is if you have great spin and you have great efficiency of that spin, that leads to movement. And that's really what you care about. You care about a curveball that drops off the table, or you care about a rising fastball, and spin is one of the raw elements that, if used properly, can help you get to that. So what active spin means, and this is really most useful I found for fastballs and curveballs, is it's telling you a kind of the combination of spin and spin movement. So for example, if you have on a curveball, right, perfect topspin, like it's directly a kind of 12-6 movement, you're getting pretty much everything you can get out of that spin rate. But not everybody throws it like that. Maybe you'll have it on a little bit of an angle, right? And then we start getting into the physics of it. We start getting into gyro spin. And without going too deep into a physics lesson here, the easiest example is if you think about a football or a bullet. Those spin a lot. There's a very high spin rate, but there's no movement in the direction of that spin. That's all kind of wasted, useless spin. The spin is side to side, but the movement of the football is not side to side. It's a little bit different for a baseball. So, for example, if you were to look at Justin Verlander here, you can see his active spin is 98.5. This is in percent. So what that's saying is he's getting almost perfect backspin, almost 100% perfect spin, which means he's getting the most out of his spin. So you'll have guys like, you can see down the list, not all of these guys have the highest spin rate, but they're getting the most out of their spin. And so it's really difficult to increase your spin, but it might be possible to use your spin more effectively. And that can help you get to more movement, which again is the entire point, moving the baseball so that hitters can't hit it.
So once again, we notice that fastball is even more truncated here, right? It's not sinker and four seamer. It's just all fastballs. So that encompasses two seamers, sinkers, and four seamers, obviously. So if we reverse, or I should say inverse the leaderboard here, and we flip it so it's the bottom up, we still see some guys that one would consider being having good fastball. Well, maybe not Garrett Richards, but you see some big names here. Is there a benefit at all to having a very, very low active spin, or you just never really want to see that?
Well, it sort of depends what you're trying to do. If you're for a fastball, right? If you're trying to get a rising fastball, you want to have high spin and high active spin. Verlander is very good at that, right? And he's also, you can see it in his release point. It's very tall. It's very straight over the top. I think that's part of how he gets his elite active spin. If you are trying to, have your ball sink, you don't necessarily want a high spin or using all of your spin, right? Not everybody's trying to get that Verlander-esque, Doolittle-esque rising fastball. So there's not one right way to do it, but this sort of helps pitchers and fans understand sort of the basics behind how these pitches move. And there's a lot of pitchers who are starting to understand this and changing the way they throw to try to get more or less, if necessary, out of their spin.
Yeah, this is so important to hear, and that's why I'm kind of going over it in this tutorial, because I want people listening to realize that just because a number is high or a number is low doesn't necessarily mean that one pitcher is any is any better at one particular thing. Context is super, super important. So even though we're just looking at one leaderboard, it's important to remember the context of other leaderboards as well. Can you talk about how crazy it is that there's only one 100 on here, and that's Rich Hill's 100% curveball?
It made me so happy when I saw that, because he is a guy who has specifically talked about, everybody knows the story of the injuries and how he kind of fell off the map and was reborn in his late 30s by working with Brian Bannister, who basically said, you've got this great curveball, you should use it a lot. And this basically means that he is getting as much as he possibly can out of his curveball spin. There might be guys with a higher total spin who aren't using it as effectively, and he's probably got higher movement than those guys. He's really, I think, a wonderful name to be at the top of this list. And also, since you have it sorted by this, Adam Wainwright and Trevor Bauer and Max Fried are also guys with outstanding curveballs. And this kind of tells you a little bit of how they're getting the most out of what they have available to them.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, we've gone over this in past tutorials. Go ahead and click on Rich Hill's name. You can go right to his profile. You can see examples of virtually every curveball he's thrown over the past couple of years. You can do this with everyone. Click on the name, go to their player page, and explore. So last but not least, why don't we move to this pitch movement leaderboard? A little bit more in depth here. So what are we looking at as soon as we come to the pitch movement leaderboard?
Like pretty much every other page, it is initially sorted by four seamers, and it is sorted, if you scroll down below the table, to highest vertical movement. Now, it's really important to understand what these numbers are showing here. These numbers are different than you will see at other sites like Fangraphs or Brooks Baseball. And the reason for that is at the other sites, they are showing at numbers that are kind of compared to this theoretical idea of a spin-free baseball. They're taking gravity out of the mix, and that makes a ton of sense. It's exactly the way you would do it if you had a great background in physics, and it makes a lot of things easier. But what we found is those numbers were a little hard to grasp for the common fan because they weren't really with gravity. But if you're watching a game and you're watching this curveball drop 4 feet, well, gravity is a big deal. So we tried to show this in terms of real world movement. That's actually easiest to show if we go over to the curveball, because the curveball is the one that most visually drops. So you can't really see a rising fastball so much, but you can definitely see a curveball drop. So the way this is sorted is who has the most vertical drop above average. And that's the entire thing here. It will show you both the raw number of drop in inches, right? So for example, let's look at Trevor Bauer, he's number 2 there, where it says movement 63.6. That means his curveball drops 63.5 inches. But the important number there is how much that is versus the average. And the average that's being compared to is at similar velocities, right? So it's +2 and -2 miles per hour, also at a similar release point. So what this is saying is, compared to other curveballs that have a similar velocity, he's getting 9.5 more inches of drop. The way it has to be done, the reason it has to be done like that is because because movement, gravity requires time. And you don't simply want to say that the guys with the slowest curveballs that have the most time to move are the best, right? Like if you threw your curveball 60 miles an hour, you get a ton of drop. Is that better than a guy who throws it harder, just doesn't have the time to drop? So the way we did this is by comparing everything versus average. The red column there shows it in inches. The one next to it, you can do it in percent if you want. And I think, especially if you up the minimums a little bit, the names on this curveball list are super satisfying. Like, yes, of course, Bauer has a very good curveball. Of course, Seth Lugo should be there and Mike Fiers.
Yeah, and it's so important to reiterate what you just said too about sort of the buckets that these guys are put into by velocity, because I know it tricks up a lot of people where they come to a page and they say they see Joe Biagini here with 67.1 in the movement column, and they're curious as to why he's number 3. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's because of those buckets, right?
Yes, exactly right. He's being compared to other curveballs in the so he's at 77. So let's say in the 75 to 79 mile an hour range.
Okay, great. So let's take a quick look here at some of the other ways that we can sort, right? So if we click on the left, we see horizontal movement versus average in inches. Can you break down some of the other options that are in here?
Yeah, so when it says versus average, that's the number I was saying there. So that's the 9 or 10 or however many inches there are. What's actually cool is if you scroll up to the top and you don't just sort by curveball, you do it by all pitches. This really shows a cool visual. And then you'll be able to see what I mean when we go back and change some of these other options. So if you make it all pitches, you'll see, okay, there's just like a big scatter plot of dots that don't mean anything because it's all against average. So you can see everything is kind of centered on the 0 there. This doesn't really tell you much of anything at all. But what's cool is if you go and change those 2 drop downs below the chart there to just the second one there. So horizontal movement in inches on the left and vertical movement in inches on the right. So this is showing like the real world what happens, and all of a sudden you see the pitch types get grouped. As you can see on the vertical axis, more rise is going up and more drop is going down, less break and more break. All of a sudden you can see that curveballs in blue have more drop, which obviously makes sense, and more break. And you can hover over any of those and get anybody's name. You can see like at the very bottom, Alec Mills gets a ton of drop. Doesn't necessarily make him successful. Obviously, you got to have velocity, you got to have command. There's a million other things that go into success. But this is kind of just a cool way to see how pitches move, right? Obviously, curveballs drop the most, and then you go up and you get into sliders that don't drop quite as much as curveballs, and you kind of go up and down the line at the very top in red. Well, fastballs, 4-seamers aren't supposed to drop at all. I really like looking at it this way just to kind of like really visualize how pitches and different pitch types are supposed to move. And then what's also fun is if you see a dot that doesn't necessarily make sense, it's not necessarily that the pitch classifier is wrong. It's just that some guys like to call things that are definitely a curveball a slider, or vice versa. And we always defer to what the pitcher wants it to be, not what the data necessarily says.
Yeah, Corey Kluber's, I feel like a good example is He's almost nestled around some sliders in there, but I'm pretty sure he sticks with that being a curveball, right?
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, I always like doing this because as an OCD kid, it reminds me of like getting a bunch of M&Ms and having one big glob of them, and then just sorting them into all the colors that you want to eat. And just to remember too, we've talked about this in previous tutorials. All these colors are the same throughout the entire website, right? So if you wanted to look at one guy's particular K-zone plot from a game, you can always remember that fastball four seamers, excuse me, are red, and I believe curveballs are blue, and sliders are yellow, changeups are green. So it's good to remember this color coding as it sticks throughout the entire website. Can you then break down, there's two more in that drop down in the bottom left, what we're looking at when we look at horizontal movement, percentage, break versus average?
Yes. So if you look at the top three items in that drop down, that corresponds to the three items in the columns in the tables below. So for example, movement versus average is exactly what's highlighted in red or blue. Just the second one, movement, is just raw movement, total number. And then percentage break against average is that same column. If you wanted to say, instead of 12 inches more break than average, maybe you could say 30% more break than average. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. And then, velocity is exactly what you'd expect. Speed is miles per hour.
Yeah. Okay, great. And that's the average speed one, which is at the very
Yes.
bottom. Okay, great. So one last question while we have you here, because I think this will be really important for people watching this tutorial to realize you obviously do plenty of research. I can imagine it makes up a majority of your job. How do you utilize any of these three when you're starting to do your research into a pitcher, maybe going into a Statcast broadcast?
Well, the first thing I always like to see is just who's interesting. Like you can go up, let's say, for example, I'm doing a Statcast broadcast, right? And it's, I don't know, Reds and Dodgers. You can go up to the top and you can sort by team. So that's probably the first thing I'll do. So let's say I'll sort by Reds, right? And update it. And then that will only show me Reds. And right away, the color coding tells me a lot. Because this isn't just comparing guys against the Reds. This is the same color coding you saw against the entire league. So, for example, right away I can see, okay, well, Bauer's got great drop on his curveball, and Sonny Gray has got great movement on a couple of his pitches, both horizontally and vertically. Or maybe I'll go say, okay, well, this guy's in blue. He really gets poor movement because that's below average. Right away that's a story, or that's a leaderboard. If, for example, let's say Bauer's curveball is very effective, gets a ton of strikes, well, this helps me explain why. Vice versa, if a guy's getting pounded and it's very blue, this helps me explain why as well. So yeah, research is a ton of it, and this is kind of a quick and visual way to just sort of get to who's got not necessarily good and bad, but let's say like above average or below average, and a lot of times that does correspond to good and bad, but again, not always.
I don't want to put you on the spot here too much, but is there any one pitcher or pitch that has stuck out to you? I mean, we brought up Bauer, we brought up Corey Kluber. In the mounds of research that you're done, is there one that perpetually sticks out to you as either being surprising or one that you just can't believe he gets this much movement or spin to it?
Well, I'm going to give you my two favorite ones because they're on the same team.
Oh, great.
And if you show everybody the Rays leaderboard here, you will see Colin Poche, who, if you know me at all, I'm a huge Colin Poche fanboy because he only throws like 92 or whatever, and he throws it like 89% of the time, that four-seam fastball. But he gets a lot of strikeouts, and you want to understand why. Well, you can see he has elite four-seam rise. He doesn't even have like the best spin rate in the world, but he's got pretty good efficiency, and this shows you right here. He's getting 4 inches more rise or 4 inches less drop, if you prefer to think about it that way, than everybody. And then the second one is Chaz Rowe's frisbee slider. I knew when we started doing this, we've been watching Chaz Rowe gifs for years, right? I'm sure you guys, the pitcher list stuff have highlighted it a bunch of times. And I knew if he didn't rate highly on one of these, it was all wrong. Sure. And it popped out that he has 15 inches more than a foot additional horizontal break on his slider than the average slider his velocity. And that's when I knew we were onto something.
It's unfair, and it's also unfair for anyone facing the Rays, just the bullpen. If you look at some of there's everything on the extremes here. Colin Poche's curveball all the way up at the very, very top in vertical movement versus average in inches. And then, on the bottom right, as you brought up, Chaz Rowe, and then at the very bottom, Tyler Glasnow's curveball. I mean, that's just, if that doesn't show you how many weapons they have, I really don't know what does. I don't know if there's any other team that has 4 different people with 4 distinct different pitches, or at least 3 distinct different pitches on different ends of the axes here.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you were to sort by just four-seamers, you would see that they have, I think, 3 of the top 6 or whatever in four-seam rise. Poche, Nick Anderson, and I guess he's since been traded, but Emilio Pagan as well. So it's pretty clear they have a type.
Oh, yeah, really. And that's another fantastic point. It's a great way for you guys to learn more, not just about how to analyze pitchers, but how to analyze your favorite organization. You might be able to see some sort of organizational trends that different organizations followed over the years. For example, I imagine if we had this data 6 or 7 years ago, we could see what the Pirates were doing with sinkers and two-seamers. So it's a really good way to learn about what your organization is doing. That's going to handle it for the 3 leaderboards today. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Alex.
All right. So once again, if you want, go. Obviously, you probably follow Mike at this point on Twitter. If you don't, you're making a mistake. Go follow him there at Mike_Petriello. And that's going to do it for this tutorial. We'll catch you guys next time.